The grand luminary chamber of the Kyler hegemony pulsed with the internalized twilight of a dying star, its vast, vaulted ceiling a mosaic of captured nebulae swirling in deliberate, slow motion above the assembled sovereigns and high arbiters. The air, thick with the ozone tang of concentrated psionic energy and the heavy, metallic scent of aged bronze, vibrated with barely suppressed anxiety. At the nexus of the massive, crystalline debating table, the supreme syzygy, Lord Krill, leaned forward, his three primary sensory stalks trembling infinitesimally. Before them floated the flickering, incomplete sensor projection of the anomaly, a single, crude vessel breaching the regulated demarcation zones of the Perseid Veil, a boundary held inviolate since the dawn of the fifth cycle. The silence preceding Krill's address was not one of contemplation, but of shared, deep-seated dread, the kind that settles into the very marrow of an ancient, established civilization when the predictable order is violently disrupted by the truly unknown. The Kyler prized predictability above all else. Their civilization spanned millennia, built on layers of meticulous stratification and layered oversight, and this intrusion was an affront to the very foundation of their structured reality. "The scout reports," Krill stated, his voice a low, resonant hum translated directly into the cognitive matrices of the assembled delegates, bypassing the cumbersome mechanisms of verbal translation, "are fragmented, inconsistent, and frankly, deeply unsettling. The entity responsible for this transit identifies itself, through primitive broadcast signals, as humanity. The designation holds no resonance within the Galactic Concordance archives, nor within the sequestered histories of the founding races. Their vessel, a construction of singular, brute functionality, displays propulsion signatures entirely outside established relativistic mechanics. It generates localized spacetime distortions without the necessary harmonic stabilization fields. How arbiters can a species operate at such fundamental levels of energetic mismanagement and yet achieve transspatial transit?" Krill gestured toward the projection, which abruptly sharpened, focusing on the vessel's hull, a rough, angular construction of dull, matte material, utterly devoid of the graceful curves and aesthetic integration characteristic of civilized shipbuilding. It looked, to the Kyler eye, like a hastily sharpened shard of rock tossed into the cosmic sea. High Arbiter Vexler, representing the bureaucratic continuity of the hegemony, projected a wave of cold, calculated skepticism. "Lord Syzygy, the primitive nature of the conveyance is precisely the point of concern. Such erratic energy manipulation suggests either overwhelming, reckless abundance of resources, a trait common to newly emergent, unstable civilizations, or a profound, almost willful ignorance of established physical limitations. We have detected no coherent FTL drive signatures, no warp signature that our predictive models can process. It is, effectively, an uncontrolled kinetic impact event that simply failed to disintegrate upon entering our localized gravitational well. They are either suicidal or profoundly incompetent." Vexler's analysis was rooted in centuries of codified galactic law, which stipulated that any species capable of traversing interstellar space must adhere to the established physics understood by the hegemony. Humanity seemed to be laughing at physics. The representative from the mercantile guilds, a being known only as the broker, injected a sharp, mercenary concern into the collective awareness. "Incompetence, Lord Krill, is often a vector for unforeseen complications. If they operate outside known physics, their resource acquisition methods, their technological base, and their territorial ambitions are entirely opaque. Have the preliminary xenolinguistic analyses yielded any indication of their core motivation? Are they seeking trade, sanctuary, or merely the uncontrolled consumption of local stellar matter?" The broker's concern was pragmatic. Stability ensured predictable markets. Volatility destroyed profit margins. This humanity represented a massive, unpredictable variable introduced into a carefully managed equation. Krill focused his attention on the holographic representation of the human vessel, which now drifted silently near the observation satellite network established at the fringe of the regulated zone. "The signals are chaotic. Repetitive patterns, certainly, suggesting language, but devoid of the complex mathematical underpinnings we associate with true sentience. No nested recursion, no sophisticated temporal sequencing. They transmit crude visual representations, images of biological forms, highly asymmetrical, bipedal, and remarkably fragile. Their dominant emotional signatures, filtered through the rudimentary psychoscans, suggest high degrees of internal conflict, rapid, hormonal shifts, and a perplexing reliance on localized, non-telepathic communication methods. They are, by every measurable metric of mature galactic society, juveniles. A deep, resonant wave of agreement pulsed through the chamber from the representatives of the eldest houses, those lineages whose memory extended back before the consolidation of the hegemony itself. They remembered the chaos of the unification wars, the near extinction caused by the reckless expansion of the early Zidonian Empire. They saw in this human arrival the potential for similar, untamed disaster. "Prudence dictates immediate quarantine, Lord Syzygy," projected Elder Thalnaris, his internal voice tinged with the weariness of 10,000 cycles. "We permit no uncontrolled variable to contaminate the established structures. We must initiate Protocol Omega, containment and observation until comprehensive psychological profiling is complete. If they exhibit aggression, swift sterilization of the offending vessel is warranted before they can pollute the wider sectors." The call for preemptive destruction, while severe, carried the weight of historical necessity within the hegemony's political calculus. Krill allowed the tension to mount, drawing the fear and uncertainty of his council into a palpable pressure that mirrored the atmospheric density of his own world. "Patience, Elder. We have observed them for the duration of 3 standard rotations. They have made no aggressive moves. They have not attempted to breach the veil. They simply waited. Their communications, however crude, have shifted. They are now broadcasting a standardized, high-priority hailing sequence, one derived, curiously, from the archaic universal distress beacon protocols established during the First Contact Accords, protocols long since deemed obsolete. The use of the ancient, legally binding distress protocol struck a nerve within the diplomatic corps. It was not a challenge. It was an appeal to historical obligation, a move of surprising, if perhaps accidental, legal sophistication for a species described as primitive. Vexler shifted his stance, his internal systems registering a slight elevation in his own stress metrics. An appeal to outdated law? This suggests a manipulative streak. They understand our legal framework enough to exploit its historical precedents, yet they cannot manage basic energy stabilization for their transit drive. The contradiction is maddening. "It is not contradiction, Arbiter," offered a voice rarely heard in the primary council, that of the chief xenolinguist, a specialized cast member named Silva, whose focus was the study of fundamental semantic structures. Silva's projection was quiet, almost apologetic, yet carried an undeniable authority born of specialized knowledge. "Their communication is layered. The energy signature of the hailing beacon is rudimentary, designed for brute force penetration across distances. However, layered beneath that crude signal within the modulation of the carrier wave, we detect complexity. Not complexity of language, but complexity of intent. It is layered like sedimentary rock. The surface is crude appeal. The substrata is highly specific, information-dense data exchange, encoded in mathematical constants we had forgotten were universal." Krill nodded slowly, the movement causing the light reflecting off his carapace to ripple. "Elaborate, Silva. What information do they transmit?" "They transmit knowledge, Lord Syzygy, not technological schematics, but foundational constants. The precise value of the strong nuclear force, calculated to a staggering degree of precision. The asymptotic limit of the gravitational constant. Data sets that require computational power far exceeding what their vessel's apparent energy output should permit. They are not merely asking for entry. They are offering a key to deeper understanding, concealed within a shell of apparent incompetence." Silva paused, allowing the implications to settle. "They communicate with the efficiency of true masters, cloaked in the language of beginners. They are either exhibiting a terrifying level of self-control, or their priorities are profoundly alien to our own understanding of political necessity." The room fell into a profound, protracted silence, the swirling nebulae above seeming to slow their eternal dance. The Kyler hegemony dealt invisible power in structured displays of dominance and established hierarchy. This subtle, data-driven approach, offering profound knowledge while feigning weakness, was strategically opaque. It bypassed the expected aggression, the expected supplicatory begging, the expected challenge. It circumvented the very structure of first contact protocols. "If they possess this level of understanding of universal constants," Elder Thalnaris projected, his previous certainty eroded by professional doubt, "then their apparent technological crudeness is a deliberate obfuscation, a shield. Why employ such? A strategy to gauge our reaction, to avoid confrontation until we reveal our defensive capabilities." Perhaps, Krill murmured, his attention now entirely focused on the implications of this dual communication. They do not seek to gauge us, Elder. Perhaps they are merely communicating with absolute clarity, albeit in a manner we are unequipped to immediately categorize. They present the data they deem most essential for establishing trust, shared reality, shared physics. They bypass the politics of aggression and appeal directly to the intellect, the foundation upon which our own civilization was built. They force us to acknowledge their competence before they allow us to judge their form. The atmosphere shifted from fear of the unknown to a profound, cerebral apprehension. If humanity was not the primitive aggressor they feared, nor the easily manipulated weakling they hoped for, they were something far more dangerous to the hegemony's established order, equals capable of profound self-control and possessing knowledge they themselves might have long since forgotten. Krill issued the decision, his voice gaining a firmness that settled the collective apprehension, replacing it with the cold necessity of action. Vexler, prepare the diplomatic detachment. Silva, lead the decryption effort on the underlying data streams. We will accept the appeal. We will respond using the standardized, non-threatening protocol established for communication with species demonstrating emergent logical capacity, Protocol Tau 7. We will invite the vessel to the nearest neutral station for formal parley. But let this be understood by all present. Our defense matrices remain at maximum readiness. We will greet their intelligence, but we will observe their biology with utmost suspicion. The age of unchallenged hegemonic supremacy may require nuanced reevaluation. The projection of the human vessel remained still against the backdrop of the stardusted void, a dull, gray intrusion into the Kyler aesthetic universe. It waited with an unnerving, passive quality, a quality that felt less like submission and more like the poised patience of a predator that has already assessed the entire terrain and found the vulnerable points. The neutral station designated for the initial contact, designated Convergence Point Theta, was a monument to Kyler architectural austerity. Vast, windowless obsidian structures orbiting a cool, dim binary star. It was designed for maximum psychological effect, to make any visiting species feel profoundly small, transient, and observed. When the human vessel finally approached, utilizing a propulsion method that still defied satisfactory modeling, a smooth, near-instantaneous translational jump that left behind no lingering residual energy signature, the Kyler protocols struggled to adapt. The human craft did not dock according to established vectoring guidance. It simply stopped precisely at the designated ingress point, maintaining perfect equilibrium without visible maneuvering thrusters. The diplomatic delegation, Vexler, Silva, and a phalanx of heavily shielded security automatons, waited in the main reception bay, a cavernous space designed to accommodate species of vastly different gravimetric and atmospheric requirements. The airlock cycling sequence, initiated remotely by the human vessel, was disturbingly fast. There was no atmospheric bleed, no equalization phase, just the heavy, grinding retraction of the barrier plates. When the opening was complete, a heavy, profound silence descended upon the Kyler observers. The first thing that entered was not a towering ambassador, nor a shimmering energy manifestation, but a single figure clad in a utilitarian environmental suit of the same dull, matte material as the ship. The suit was bulky, obscuring all identifying biological features save for the helmet, which featured a dark, reflective visor. The human moved with a measured, deliberate economy of motion, utterly unlike the frantic, energy-wasting movements Silva had predicted based on their preliminary psychoscans. It did not rush. It did not hesitate. It simply stepped across the threshold and stopped, perfectly centered in the sterile chamber. Vexler took the initiative, projecting his address via the universal translator matrix embedded in the station's architecture, ensuring a baseline of audibility for any unexpected sensory modalities. Greetings, representative of humanity. I am Arbiter Vexler of the Kyler hegemony. You have been granted provisional access to Convergence Point Theta under the parameters of Protocol Tau 7. State your designation and the purpose of your arrival. The single human stood motionless for a full minute, the silence stretching tautly across the vast chamber, a silence that felt manufactured, purposeful. Then, a signal emanated directly from the suit's external speaker grill, a synthesized voice devoid of modulation, yet remarkably clear, SB. Eking in the archaic, foundational language of the first contact accords, the same language used in the initial, crude broadcast. I am designated Commander Jian Li. I represent the Unified Terran Directorate. Our purpose is diplomatic engagement. We extend this gesture of contact under the established principles of mutual recognition and shared exploration. The voice was calm, almost monotone, yet carried an implicit weight that belied its lack of emotional inflection. It was the voice of someone reciting a fundamental truth, not pleading for recognition. Silva, fascinated by the deceptive simplicity, projected a query focused on the immediate data exchange. Commander Lee, we acknowledge your transmission of foundational physical constants. The precision recorded necessitates computational ability far exceeding the observable energy envelope of your conveyance. How do you reconcile this disparity? Are you utilizing a form of energy harvesting that is currently unknown to us? The human tilted its head slightly, a gesture that might have indicated consideration or confusion. Arbiter Silva, the synthesized voice responded, seemingly accessing the name from the Kyler's own internal communication network without direct inquiry. The vessel is a transport. Its energy output is necessarily limited for longevity and discrete transit. The computation was performed prior to departure. We do not require massive energy expenditure for knowledge acquisition. We utilize focused, self-correcting algorithmic structures capable of simulating universal mechanics internally. Wexler projected a sharp spike of suspicion. Simulation is not verification. You transmit verified constants derived from methodologies you refuse to disclose. This remains an asymmetry of information that impedes trust. Commander Lee took one slow step forward, stopping precisely 3 Kyler paces from the projection table's edge. Arbiter Wexler, trust is not a commodity exchanged in diplomatic opening statements. Trust is the eventual byproduct of predictable, rational interaction. We offer verified truths because we understand that the hegemony values structure above all else. We offer the bedrock of shared reality first, so that you may then evaluate our methods without the cloud of ontological suspicion. The sheer, cold logic of the statement caused a noticeable ripple of discomfort through the automatons flanking the delegation. It was a direct acknowledgement of the Kyler's deepest cultural imperative, delivered without flattery or subservience. We invite you to remove your environmental containment, Wexler continued, reverting to standard procedure while mentally cataloging the human's ability to instantly absorb and utilize internal station data. The atmosphere here is calibrated for your projected biological needs, although we must caution you that our gravimetric constants are maintained at a level designed to promote mental acuity. Commander Lee remained silent for a beat, then raised one gloved hand and tapped a sequence on a panel located on the wrist of the suit. A quiet hiss preceded the retraction of the helmet. The sudden exposure of the human face caused a collective, near-silent shockwave through the Kyler contingent. The face was startlingly asymmetrical, dominated by large, forward-facing visual sensors, eyes of a deep, unsettling brown, surrounded by softer integument than anticipated. The facial structure was mobile, conveying micro-expressions even in repose, but it was the calmness that was overwhelming. There was no visible tremor, no darting apprehension, no sign of the frenetic internal activity their initial scans had suggested. This was a being perfectly at ease in an environment designed to intimidate, presenting its most vulnerable biological components without reservation. We adhere to the atmospheric parameters, Lee stated, indicating the slight, almost imperceptible relaxing of the suit's internal pressure regulators. We trust your calibration, Arbiter. We extend the same trust you demand of us, not by blind faith, but by observing the logical consistency of your environment. Silva stepped forward, moving past the automatons, compelled by pure intellectual curiosity. Commander Lee, your species, humanity. You have not appeared on any recorded star charts. Your origins are untraced. You emerged from a periphery zone previously designated as a void of developing life. Yet you possess knowledge rivaling the hegemony's oldest archived axioms. Explain this discrepancy. Are you a splinter faction of a greater power, a refugee population utilizing archaic knowledge? Lee met Silva's complex visual sensors directly. We are indigenous to a single, gravitationally stable planet within the Orion Arm designated Earth. We are not refugees, we are explorers. Our knowledge base, Arbiter, is not archaic, it is hard-won. We achieved interstellar capability through a period we term the Great Filter, a crucible of self. Inflicted destruction, resource collapse, and existential warfare that nearly extinguished our species 3 centuries ago. Wexler interjected, his voice regaining some of its commanding pitch. A species that survives such a collapse usually emerges fractured, predatory, or deeply isolationist. You emerge centralized, unified enough to execute a long-range, covert interstellar mission, and yet you broadcast overtures of peace and data sharing. This is inconsistent with established sociological models of catastrophic recovery. Inconsistency, Lee responded, a faint, almost imperceptible tightening around the human's eyes suggesting a nuanced acknowledgement of Wechsler's point, is often merely a failure of observation on the part of the observer. The great filter necessitated a unified approach to survival. When faced with absolute annihilation, the certainty that our internal conflicts would lead to the extinction of our entire planetary heritage, we were forced to develop not merely superior technology, but superior cohesion. The logic of survival overrode the logic of individual conflict. We learned that the universe does not distinguish between different factions of the same species. It only recognizes the presence or absence of life. This was the first profound philosophical revelation. The Kyler hegemony was built upon the principle of controlled stratification, where differing factions, the merchants, the arbiters, the houses, maintained balance through formalized, perpetual tension. The idea of a species abandoning internal conflict entirely for the sake of collective survival was almost unimaginable, a societal anomaly. Silva pressed the point. Your psychological profile indicated high internal conflict. If the external conflict ceased, where did the internal drives manifest? Lee offered a faint, thin smile that felt alien and deeply unsettling on the angular human features. They did not cease, Arbiter. They were redirected. The drive for dominance, for acquisition, for superiority, these are inherent biological imperatives. We did not excise them. We refocused them outward, toward understanding the universe, toward engineering solutions to universal problems, rather than engineering solutions to eliminate our neighbors. Our conflict now is with entropy, with ignorance, with the limits of physical law. Wechsler felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's atmospheric controls. This was not the dangerous, chaotic adolescent species they had prepared to quarantine. This was a species that had weaponized its own internal failings, turning evolutionary pressure outward against the cosmos itself. Commander Lee, Wechsler stated formally, the hegemony operates on the principle of controlled stability. Unchecked expansion or unpredictable innovation is viewed as a threat to the equilibrium we have maintained for millennia. Your arrival signals a potential break in that equilibrium. We must understand your technological trajectory. Present us with a demonstration of your capabilities that is non-threatening, yet definitive of your mastery. Lee nodded, accepting the challenge with immediate, unnerving readiness. We anticipated this requirement, Arbiter. We did not arrive unprepared for scrutiny. Lee stepped back toward the airlock, pausing only to look back at the assembled delegates. Arbiter Silva, your recent work on localized quantum entanglement resonance fields, the theoretical matrices you published for internal critique 3 cycles ago. We have refined the stabilizing parameters. If you permit us access to a minimal mass substrate, we can demonstrate the viable application. Silva recoiled internally, the suggestion a profound violation of protocol. Publishing theoretical matrices was standard for hegemonic vetting. Allowing an outsider immediate access to refined proprietary theory was unthinkable. Yet, the acknowledgement of Silva's obscure internal publication was itself a massive data intrusion. The audacity, Wechsler projected fiercely. You presume access to our secured internal communications. We do not presume, Arbiter. We observe, Lee corrected calmly. Your network security is extensive against conventional brute force intrusion or kinetic attack. It is less robust against subtle semantic analysis of low-frequency broadcast leakage during internal data routing, a feature that allowed us to map the structural integrity of your localized station defenses during our approach. We detected your theoretical work on entanglement stabilization. It is elegant but flawed in its thermal regulation algorithms. We can correct this. The air in the chamber seemed to thin further. This was not merely advanced hacking. This was an instantaneous, comprehensive structural analysis of their political and technological weak points, executed while traversing interstellar space. Access to the substrate is denied until a framework of mutual security is established, Wechsler declared firmly. Then, we will offer a demonstration independent of hegemonic systems, Lee countered. A demonstration of our fundamental power offered as a pledge of non-hostility. Lee raised both hands, palms outward, a gesture that seemed universal in its presentation of openness. Slowly, deliberately, Commander Lee lowered the output of the environmental suit's internal life support systems to a negligible level, forcing the suit's sensors to rely entirely on the external station environment. The visual display on the helmet, which had remained dark, flickered to life, showing not the reflection of the Kyler chamber, but a stream of impossibly complex data. "Arbiter Silva," Lee said, the voice now overlaid with the faint crackle of externalized processing power. "Your equation for the boundary condition of information decay in a closed system requires a scalar modification derived from the non-baryonic mass distribution of the local galactic cluster. Observe." The air directly in front of Lee shimmered. It did not ignite, nor did it warp spacetime in the violent manner the Kyler associated with uncontrolled energy release. Instead, the air seemed to resolve. A perfect, flawless sphere of pure crystalline structure materialized, hanging in the air, approximately the size of a Kyler head. It was composed of interlocking geometric planes, shifting and interlocking with impossible fluidity, exhibiting no detectable boundary layer or thermal emission. It was, to the Kyler perception, a physical manifestation of pure, abstract mathematical order. Silva stared, her cognitive processes straining to categorize the phenomenon. It was stable. It required no external power source. It appeared to be drawing the necessary energy directly from the ambient vacuum fluctuations, structured into a visible, tangible form by processes entirely unknown. "This," Lee stated, his voice regaining its quiet calm, "is a physical representation of the modified scalar value you required for your entanglement matrix. It is a structure of informational integrity, held stable purely by internal computational cohesion. We offer this as proof. We understand the underlying mathematics of reality at a level that allows us to sculpt the void itself. We do not require large fusion reactions or massive drive cores to manipulate the physical universe. We manipulate the information that defines it." Wexler felt the cold dread return, amplified 1,000-fold. This was not mere technology, this was philosophy made tangible. They were not just dealing with powerful engineers, they were dealing with ontological architects. The hegemony, for all its size and ancient might, relied on brute force application of derived physics. Humanity wielded the source code. "Remove the construct," Wexler managed, the order tight with forced command. Lee made a subtle gesture with one hand, and the crystalline sphere simply vanished, not dispersing, but ceasing to be informationally defined in that space, leaving no residue, no thermal trace, nothing to indicate it had ever existed. "We demonstrate capability without aggression," Lee concluded. "Now, we request formal dialogue regarding our shared presence in this sector. We are prepared to share information regarding the origins of the very physical laws you utilize, knowledge that required us to pass through the crucible of near extinction." The shift in the Kyler Council proceedings, moving from the threat assessment phase to the formal diplomatic engagement, was unprecedentedly rapid. Lord Krill, sensing the seismic shift in the balance of power, a shift not achieved through warfare or political maneuver, but through undeniable, cold demonstration of superior, esoteric understanding, ordered the immediate transition to the High Council Archives Chamber, a place reserved only for matters concerning the structural integrity of the hegemony itself. The atmosphere in the High Council was different now, stripped of the hazy twilight and replaced by stark white illumination designed to reveal every detail, every nuance of posture and expression. Krill sat at the apex, the remaining sovereigns arrayed around him. Commander Lee stood alone in the center of the vast, polished floor, flanked only by two smaller, maintenance-class drone units that remained inert near the entryway. Krill initiated the dialogue, skipping all preliminary pleasantries. "Commander Lee, we have reviewed the data you offered, the foundational constants. We have verified the refinements you proposed to Arbiter Silva's entanglement model. The results are mathematically flawless. You have demonstrated a level of abstract comprehension previously reserved for theoretical entities theorized during the Age of Solitude. Why withhold this knowledge from the wider galaxy? Why operate under the guise of primitivism?" Lee maintained his posture of quiet stillness. "Lord Krill, we did not operate under a guise, we operated under a necessity. The wider galaxy, as you term it, is dominated by established powers who view emergent civilizations through a lens of established hierarchy. The history of the concordance is replete with examples of nascent species being either absorbed, sterilized, or subjugated before they achieved true intellectual maturity. We required the opportunity to present our case from a position of non-threat, grounded in shared, verifiable reality, rather than confronting an immediate assumption of inferiority based on our physical manifestation. This was a profound indictment of the hegemony's structure, delivered not as an accusation, but as a statement of observed fact. Elder Thulnaris, representing the deeply conservative core of the hegemony, projected a wave of severe displeasure. You imply that the hegemony cannot recognize genuine intellectual achievement when presented with it. We are the guardians of galactic stability. You are the guardians of your stability, Elder Thulnaris, Lee countered, his gaze unwavering. Your history shows that stability is maintained by controlling the rate of innovation among subordinate or emerging species. We foresaw that presenting ourselves as fully capable would have triggered an immediate containment response, precisely what you were preparing before we broadcast the constants. We chose the path that led to this dialogue, rather than immediate conflict. Silva leaned forward, eager to explore the depths of this revelation. Commander, the knowledge you possess regarding the nature of the universe, the structure of spacetime, the fundamental forces, it implies a mastery over unification principles that the hegemony has pursued for millennia without success. What is the source of this accelerated understanding? Was it a singular moment of collective epiphany or a deliberate generational focus? Lee answered, and this time, the tone shifted slightly, gaining a depth of gravity that resonated even through the cold translation matrices. It was neither epiphany nor gradual focus. It was necessity born of trauma. When the collapse began on Earth, when our destructive capability exceeded our wisdom, the remaining unified council recognized that the universe was not merely a resource to be exploited, but a vastly complex system that could be irrevocably damaged by ignorance. We did not seek to master physics to gain power. We sought to master physics to ensure we did not inadvertently destroy ourselves and perhaps others. He paused, taking a breath that was purely ceremonial within the Kyler chamber. We call the period before the collapse the age of unnecessary conflict. We wasted resources, intellect, and life battling over arbitrary divisions, driven by ancient biological programming. The near extinction forced a radical, species-wide reprioritization. Our focus shifted entirely from internal stratification to external comprehension. We learned to build not bigger ships, but smarter algorithms. We learned that the greatest resource is not captured matter, but uncorrupted information. Krill absorbed this narrative, a cultural rebirth forged in near annihilation. It mirrored in a terrifyingly efficient way the foundational myths of the Kyler, but executed with a speed and ruthlessness that the hegemony, mired in its own political inertia, could never achieve. Your vessel, Krill stated, returning to the concrete evidence. It is small, utilitarian, and appears to be constructed from common alloys, yet it navigated interstellar voids in a manner that bypassed standard detection protocols. If you possess the capability to manipulate fundamental constants to create stable informational constructs, why utilize such crude transportation? Because, Lee replied, the human expression now settling into something akin to profound weariness. We are practical beings, Lord Krill. The voyage required immense computational power, yes, but minimal raw energy expenditure for transit. We used what was necessary for the journey, not what was necessary to impress the destination. We came here to negotiate, not to stage a military parade. A massive, energy-intensive vessel would have signaled aggressive intent immediately, triggering the containment protocols you first considered. We chose the path of minimal footprint and maximum intellectual leverage. This revealed a layered strategic depth far beyond what the hegemony had anticipated. They had prepared for an invasion or a plea. They were met with an audit. Wexler, recovering his diplomatic footing, recognized the crucial turning point. If humanity was willing to share the knowledge that saved them from self-destruction, the hegemony could integrate this understanding, potentially solving many of its own systemic stagnation issues. Commander Lee, Wexler proposed formally, the hegemony acknowledges the profound nature of your species' achievement and the efficacy of your self-correction. We propose an immediate cessation of all hostile posture. In exchange, for continued, unfettered access to the foundational knowledge you possess, specifically concerning algorithmic physics and efficient energy structuring. The hegemony offers recognition, sanctuary within the regulated space, and access to our own archived galactic history and resource networks. We propose a formalized treaty of intellectual exchange. The offer was immense. It was the highest form of recognition the hegemony could bestow upon a new species, not merely integration, but the sharing of hard-won wisdom. Lee listened patiently, observing the slight waver in Wexler's projected voice that suggested genuine political compromise. When the arbiter finished, Lee looked toward Lord Krill. "We accept the framework of mutual recognition, Arbiter Wexler. We agree to the Treaty of Intellectual Exchange, under the understanding that the exchange is bidirectional. We will share the knowledge that saved us, but in return, we require full, unredacted access to the history and operational models of the Concordance, the knowledge of what other species have attempted and failed, and the political structures that govern their coexistence." Krill leaned back, processing the audacity of the request, access to the hegemony's deepest state secrets as a condition for sharing their own salvation. But the alternative, the possibility of provoking a concealed, mathematically superior opponent, was too high a risk. "Agreed," Krill affirmed. "Let the negotiations commence immediately. Silva, prepare the secure channels. We will begin with the shared algorithms." The immediate threat subsided, replaced by the monumental task of integration. The atmosphere in the chamber eased, replaced by the focused energy of high-level, urgent scholastic pursuit. The initial weeks following the Treaty of Intellectual Exchange were marked by an intensity of study within the hegemony unparalleled in the last 5 centuries. The Kyler scholastic apparatus, powerful but rigid, began to digest the human data packets. Commander Lee and a small team of human specialists, linguists, mathematicians, and theoretical engineers who had traveled on the small, unassuming vessel, operated from a secure, quarantined sector of the station. They were models of calm professionalism, interacting with the Kyler scholars not as subordinates or superiors, but as fellow researchers united by a common problem set. Silva became Lee's primary contact, a relationship built on mutual intellectual fervor that slowly eroded the Kyler prejudice. She discovered that the human approach to knowledge was characterized by a relentless drive to simplify complexity to its most elegant core, a method that circumvented the massive computational redundancy the Kyler often employed for safety margins. "Your method of modeling gravitational lensing using fractal inversion matrices is astounding, Commander Lee," Silva projected during one late-cycle session. "It reduces processing time by a factor of nearly 1,000. It suggests that the very way you perceive mathematical relationships is fundamentally different." Lee, leaning over a holographic schematic displaying a multidimensional lattice structure, replied without looking up. "We perceive reality as information, Arbiter Silva. When our civilization faced extinction, we realized that every particle, every energy exchange, every cosmological event is ultimately a data transaction. To survive, we had to learn to read the transaction logs faster and more accurately than the forces that sought to corrupt or destroy them. Our mathematics is simply an advanced form of highly efficient data parsing." Wexler, meanwhile, was tasked with the political integration, studying the human historical archives provided by the Directorate. He was tasked with understanding the age of unnecessary conflict and the subsequent Great Filter. The archives were brutal, unfiltered. Wexler witnessed imagery of planetary devastation, mass ideological purges, and technological regression caused by widespread atomic exchange, all enacted by a species that, in its prime, had achieved profound artistic and philosophical heights. The sheer scale of self-inflicted wounds was staggering. Wexler found himself wrestling with the Kyler doctrine that external threats forged unity. Humanity had proven that internal collapse often forced a superior, albeit traumatic, restructuring. One cycle, Wexler confronted Lee with a particularly devastating historical recording, a video feed showing the final collapse of a major terrestrial continent due to environmental mismanagement, combined with localized nuclear exchange. "Commander Lee," Wexler projected, his voice flat with somber reflection, "the hegemony's historical mandate is predicated on preventing exactly this scenario on a galactic scale. We have maintained an oppressive stability to prevent the resurgence of the chaos inherent in juvenile species. Yet you passed through this horror and emerged. Not brutalized, but enlightened. How do you justify the retention of this knowledge? If you reveal the precise mechanism of self-destruction, does that not invite other species to apply similar pressures to their own populations? Lee regarded the holographic devastation with the same detached seriousness he applied to an equation. Arbiter Wechsler, you mistake observation for prescription. The path to unity that humanity took was not a desirable one. It was a necessary consequence of catastrophic failure. We share this history not as a roadmap, but as a dire warning. We demonstrate the depths of our own failure so that you may see the magnitude of our commitment to not repeating it. True ethical maturity is recognizing the cost of error. And your commitment to stability, Wechsler pushed. If the hegemony were to face a significant external challenge, a force operating outside the established concordance framework, would your commitment to data efficiency outweigh the necessity of immediate, overwhelming application of force, even if it meant violating the delicate balance you observe here? Lee's dark eyes held Wechsler's gaze. Arbiter, the Directorate understands conflict. Conflict is the ultimate pressure test for systemic integrity. If an external force threatened the collective equilibrium of intelligent life, we would apply necessary force with surgical precision, guided by the most complete data available. Our goal is preservation of informational diversity and sentient potential, not territorial acquisition. If a threat endangers that potential, we will neutralize it efficiently. Force, when applied logically, is merely another form of necessary systemic correction. The Kyler delegates registered this statement with mixed reactions. It was terrifyingly rational. It lacked the bombast of aggression, but possessed the chilling finality of inevitable calculation. It was during these long exchanges that the true nature of humanity began to crystallize for the hegemony leadership. They were not inherently aggressive, but they were utterly, uncompromisingly effective. They had survived their own existential crisis by prioritizing verifiable truth and systemic cohesion above all else. Lord Krill summoned Lee to his private observation deck, overlooking the station's artificial horizon. The air was charged with the gravity of impending, necessary change. "Commander Lee," Krill began, his voice stripped of its formal projection, allowing the raw cognitive resonance to transmit. "We have integrated sufficient data to understand the scope of your technological leap. We can begin the process of retrofitting our primary computational matrices with the human algorithmic architecture within the next half-cycle. This represents the greatest shift in hegemonic operational methodology since the founding wars. We are grateful." "Lord Krill," Lee responded, maintaining his respectful distance, "we are obligated to share. The existential threat that drove our evolution is universal. We do not wish to see another species repeat our errors." "There is a further matter," Krill continued, drawing the conversation toward the central, unspoken tension. "We have shared our history, our political failures, our inherent structural flaws. We have offered access to the networks of the concordance. But the source of your knowledge, the deepest layer of your understanding, remains behind a threshold. The refinement of the entanglement matrix was impressive, but it was an application of known universal physics. What you demonstrated in the council chamber, the creation of the stable, informational construct, that transcends our current understanding of physical law. That requires a methodology that we cannot yet parse from the data sets provided." Krill fixed Lee with a stare of intense, demanding curiosity. "We need to understand the Great Filter itself, Commander. What was the final, defining lesson that forced your total systemic reorganization? We have seen the aftermath. We wish to see the catalyst." Lee stood silent for a long moment, the faint hum of the environmental suit the only sound. He looked out at the fabricated stars, a deliberate act of mirroring Krill's previous contemplative gesture. "Lord Krill," Lee said, his voice dropping to an almost inaudible frequency, "the final lesson was not about physics or technology or even politics. It was about perception. The reason we achieved mastery over the fundamentals of reality so rapidly was because we realized that the established models of physics, the ones used by the concordance, the very laws that govern Kyler society, they are incomplete. They are approximations tailored for a specific, localized environment." Krill braced himself for the next escalation. He knew this was the crucial reveal, the point where humanity moved from being a powerful peer to an entirely separate, superior category of intelligence. "The hegemony and all established concordant species," Lee continued high, his voice steady, "operate within a stable, four-dimensional construct governed by specific constants. You perceive the universe as vast, largely static, and fundamentally constrained by the limits of light speed and gravitational decay. This perception is correct, within the constraints of this local bubble of reality. Lee turned back to Krill. But the universe is not singular. It is layered. The great filter forced us to look beyond the immediate constraints of our local reality bubble. We discovered the mechanism of interdimensional bleed-through, the faint, residual signals left over when higher-dimensional structures interact with our stable continuum. He activated a small holographic projector on his wrist, and the image in the center of the room shifted dramatically. It was no longer a simulation of galactic structure. It was a dizzying, multi-layered projection of overlapping realities, colors that defied Kyler visual categorization, and structures that folded in upon themselves in non-Euclidean geometries. What you call the fabric of spacetime, Lord Krill, is merely a thin, localized membrane, a single, stable layer of a vastly larger, complex structure. The energy signatures that powered our breakthroughs, the principles that allow us to sculpt information into matter, derive from understanding how to briefly, safely interface with the higher informational gradients that permeate the voids between these stable layers. Krill felt a profound, sickening lurch in his internal equilibrium. This was not merely advanced science. This was the shattering of foundational cosmological belief. This is theoretical heresy, Krill managed, the concept threatening to overload his cognitive matrices. The stability of the concordance is based on the assumption of a singular, measurable continuum. A stable assumption, Lee agreed smoothly, until something breaches the membrane. The near extinction on Earth was not solely due to our own weapons, Lord Krill. It was the consequence of a massive, uncontrolled energetic release, the final stages of a planetary weapons system that momentarily punctured the informational membrane. It did not just destroy our landmasses, it sent a resonance signal into the higher gradients. Lee pointed to a section of the swirling chaos projection, focusing on a faint, rhythmic pulse bleeding through the noise. That signal was answered, and what answered was not a pure species. It was something ancient, something that perceives our stable continuum the way you perceive a bacterium in a Petri dish. What answers? Krill demanded, every sensor he possessed now screaming a warning that transcended political or military threat. We call them the Harvesters, Lee stated, the name resonating with absolute finality. They are not biological, not purely energetic. They are constructs of pure informational entropy. They do not conquer territory, they consume structure. They follow resonances left by uncontrolled energy release, signatures of potential instability in any localized continuum. Our war was not just against ourselves. It was a desperate attempt to suppress the resonance signature we had broadcast, before something from outside could lock onto it. The massive, millennia-old political tension within the hegemony, the rivalries between houses, the stagnation of the arbiters, suddenly seemed infinitesimally small, a childish squabble confined to a tiny, fragile room in a cosmos they fundamentally misunderstood. The treaty, Lee continued, his voice now conveying the shared burden of his species, is not merely an offer of technology for history. It is a plea for immediate, unified defense. The information we offer, the algorithmic efficiency, is essential for the hegemony to rapidly stabilize its infrastructure and purge all residual energetic inefficiencies that might broadcast a beacon. We need your logistical scale and your established political infrastructure to prepare for a true universal threat. We cannot survive the Harvesters alone, and they are already aware of this region of space because of the faint energetic echoes of the hegemony's massive, inefficient core reactors. Krill looked at the gathered sovereigns, the elders, the merchants, all their ingrained rivalries, their political maneuvering, their rigid adherence to outdated protocols, all now rendered utterly meaningless by the looming shadow of true cosmic horror. Humanity had not come to conquer. They had come because they had already fought the greater war and barely survived, carrying the scars and the hard-won knowledge necessary for the next stage of existence. Commander Lee, Krill projected, his voice resonating with a clarity born of absolute necessary purpose, shedding the pretense of arrogance. The hegemony accepts this alliance not as a political maneuver, but as an imperative for continued existence. We will dedicate every resource, every fleet, every computational core to the purging of energetic noise. And the stabilization of our domain against this external threat. Tell us what we must do to become silent. Lee nodded once, a gesture of solemn confirmation. We begin by transmitting the schematics for localized informational shielding. It requires total reorganization of power distribution, Lord Krill. It will require every being in this chamber to prioritize existential reality over political preference. We have the tools. We only require your commitment to wield them without hesitation. The Kyler hegemony, the bastion of galactic order, stood on the precipice of an enforced evolution, forced into unity not by ideology or conquest, but by the terrifying, humbling demonstration that they were merely inhabitants of a small, noisy room in a structure far larger and more dangerous than they had ever dared to imagine, saved only by the emergence of a species that had faced its own abyss and chosen, against all biological expectation, to look upward instead of inward. The cinematic tension of their arrival had resolved into the terrible clarity of a shared, monumental struggle against the true silence of the void.